Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. My name is Maralia Negron. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Director of Policy Advocacy and Research here at the network advocating against domestic violence. We're very excited to share our presentation with you today. But before we dive in, I'd like to turn it over to my team to do a quick round of introductions. So I'll pass it to my co-presenter, Shelby.
Hey everyone, my name is Shelby Hoffman Binder. I use she, her pronouns, and I serve as manager on our policy advocacy and research team. I'm really excited to be here today. I will pass things over to Imuna.
Hi everyone, I'm Imuna. I'm the Data and Research Associate for the Policy Advocacy and Research team. I conduct analysis for the Measuring Safety reports. It's nice to meet all of you.
But thanks again for joining us for our Measuring Safety report. This is 103rd Illinois General Assembly review, and this is our second Measuring Safety edition this year. So we hope that you will join us for future editions, but we're excited to provide a quick overview of what happened during the 103rd General Assembly. So for today's topics, we're going to do a quick introduction of measuring safety in this edition, and then we're going to be highlighting our key legislative initiative, which was Karina's bill that passed during the 103rd General Assembly. And then we're going to be covering new survivor-centered laws that were passed during the 103rd General Assembly, focusing on five key areas or focus areas that we categorized each of these pieces of legislation into. And then finally, we're going to be reviewing the voting records for folks for you to use as a tool so that you can see how your elected officials voted on these key survivor pieces of legislation. So on to our introduction. So first and foremost, if it's your first time joining us for a Measuring Safety launch and you're not familiar with Measuring Safety, our data reports, or with the network leads a coalition of organizations that are working to end gender-based violence, and we reach survivors by directly operating the Illinois Domestic Violence Hotline, which is available 365 days a year, 24/7 in multiple languages. We also serve our Chicagoland member organizations through training, resources, and we advocate for policies that improve the lives of survivors and organizations that serve them. So we kind of do it all, and our small but mighty team also does do trainings, and we do the bulk of our kind of systems advocacy and policy work here. So what is Measuring Safety? Measuring Safety is an annual data report that we have moved into kind of a series. So every edition of Measuring Safety is looking at a key focus area. And this edition of Measuring Safety is looking at the Illinois General Assembly, the 103rd General Assembly, and kind of legislation that was passed and enacted, signed by the governor, that impacts programs and survivors. But typically Measuring Safety we use as an advocacy tool. So we pull data from Measuring Safety to do either systems advocacy, policy advocacy, or direct advocacy for survivors. It can also be used for funding. If you're a program that's looking for resources and data on the sector, on impact for survivors, there's a ton of good data for funding pitches, funding opportunities that you can use from our Measuring Safety reports. And then finally, it is also used as an education piece and tool. We use a lot of data from our Measuring Safety reports to incorporate into our training and materials, and we'd encourage our community to do that as well. So our sources for this report, as part of every Measuring Safety launch, we like to be very transparent around the sources that we use for our reports. And the first one is Quorum, which is an online organizing, communications, and policy advocacy platform that we use during the 103rd General Assembly. This recently was rebranded. It was formerly known as Phone to Action, but this is the form that we use to do those action alerts, drive those calls, emails, tweets, or X's, and do all of that online organizing. The second source that we use is called Fast Democracy, and this is an online platform that we use for tracking, labeling, and reporting on legislative activity as it goes through the legislative process in Illinois. And we also started using this platform during the 103rd General Assembly. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we do have focus areas for our legislation that we were monitoring and tracking during the 103rd General Assembly. That's broken down into 5 categories. And so the first is court system, so looking at legislation that impacts the court system. The second is criminalized survivor relief, so survivors who have been criminalized for surviving their experience of gender-based violence. The third is survivor rights and resources. The fourth is healthcare systems, and the fifth is prevention education. So the 103rd General Assembly. For those of you that aren't familiar, the General Assembly convenes, the 103rd General Assembly convened from January 2023 when they were sworn into office until January 2025, where some folks either lost their re-election campaigns or didn't rerun for office, and so it's a new kind of term. And this happens every 2 years. There is a new General Assembly sworn into office. So again, those folks that were on the ballot get sworn into office in mid-January and serve that 2-year term in the Illinois legislature. So now we are in the 104th, but we are doing a review of the 103rd General Assembly. So in that time, the House and Senate introduced over 13,000 pieces of legislation or bills. I will use those terms interchangeably. And that is actually a common kind of number or range of pieces of legislation or bills that are introduced during any given General Assembly. Then there were 1,064 bills that were passed and signed into law by the governor in that same time frame. So our report focuses on 30 bills that were signed into law that have a concrete impact on survivors and service providers. Before we dive in deeper and take a closer look at some of these legislative initiatives, we do want to thank you and the thousands of policy advocates across Illinois who invested their time, energy into supporting legislation that the network supported. So whether that be doing, witness slips or contacting your elected officials via email, phone call, asking for meetings, your commitment to building a violence-free future is evident in the long list of legislation that we can point to and the numbers that we can point to in aggregate of the impact that witness slips and contacts that have been driven to legislators. So with every piece of legislation and action that you take, we know that we're one step closer to eliminating gender-based violence through this advocacy and policy work. And we also want to take a moment to thank the legislators who championed these survivor-centered initiatives in the 103rd General Assembly for their willingness to take up some really hard fights. Some of these pieces of legislation were very controversial. And they will result in life-saving changes for survivors throughout Illinois. So first, we're going to be looking at Karina's Law, which was our flagship legislation that we led the passage of during the 103rd General Assembly. But first, to give some context around Karina's Law or Karina's Bill, as it was formerly known before it was signed into law, we're going to talk a little bit about what the issues in the system were and why Karina's Bill was necessary to address some of these gaps. And so to establish that, we're going to take a moment and look at orders of protection. What is an order of protection? An order of protection is a comprehensive legal tool that can provide what we call 18 possible remedies to address survivor needs. And so those remedies are kind of boxes that folks can request, and a judge can either grant or deny. And an order of protection had or currently has, and that's what we were working to amend, box 14.5, which is the firearm remedy. And it explicitly required that the respondent or the person who the order of protection was against temporarily surrender those firearms in their possession. It also made it so that folks who were subject to the firearm remedy had their FOID card suspended, and that is continuing to be Illinois law after Karina's Law is enacted and takes effect. The flaws in the firearm remedy were a few, and why we needed to advocate for the passage of Karina's bill. The first being that judicial interpretation varied as to when the petitioner could request firearms removal and relief as part of an order of protection. So, depending which judge you were in front of, which courtroom you were standing in, a judge's interpretation of the law varied. Also, when the firearm remedy was issued, there was no real process outlined in statute as to how law enforcement would go about removing those firearms, what the timeline was, etc. And then, even when an order of protection was served and the respondent was informed of the firearm remedy, there was really no way to verify if the respondent had actually been disarmed, and there was kind of no follow-up to that. So how did we learn about the flaws in our system? One is, the network again is a membership organization. So we convene providers and folks doing direct service through our policy and legal advocacy committees. And we coalesce these groups, and we talk about kind of what the issues and flaws are in our systems and in providing services. And so we heard very loud and clear that firearms not being addressed properly, succinctly, and in the same way consistently was an issue. We also, through local research, we were also able to kind of monitor the fact that there was high lethality of domestic gun violence. And we have a whole report that we launched late last year. It's our Domestic Gun Violence in Illinois edition of Measuring Safety that's available for download on our website. For those of you that are interested in taking a closer look at some of the data and research we pointed to as part of our advocacy to pass Karina's bill. So we used that a lot. We talked about it a lot publicly. We talked about it in outreach and trainings when we were doing outreach to organizations to support our call to pass Karina's bill. And so that was another big indicator of why Karina's bill was necessary and needed. And then we also were involved in a statewide task force to address the intersection of domestic violence and firearms. And so we were able to meet with stakeholders at a statewide level to kind of see what the gaps were, understand the systems better, and took that feedback into account. And then finally, it's not news that there were a lot of high-profile domestic gun violence homicides over the last few years. And there was a lot of news coverage and a lot of advocacy groups and individuals who were calling for change as it relates to addressing the intersection of domestic violence and firearms. How Karina's bill, kind of the process of getting it passed, right? And there was a ton of work, obviously, that went behind the scenes from not just our team, but also from a number of organizations. And this slide is no way, in no way, shape, or form going to be able to do it justice. But I think to put it in just a small nugget of information is, Karina's bill was the network's flagship legislative initiative during the 103rd General Assembly. And it was really shaped by the lived experiences and expertise of the gender-based violence services community and survivors. The bill specifically amended the Illinois Criminal Code Protective Order Statute, as well as the Illinois Domestic Violence Act, to clarify and strengthen the law as it relates to firearm remedies in orders of protection. But the legislation had 5 iterations and bill numbers over the more than 2 years that it took to get it across the finish line and negotiate before it finally passed as House Bill 4144 in January of this year.
I'll hop in here and just share a little bit with folks about all of the different elements of the movement that really got Karina's Law across the finish line. And of course, that wouldn't have happened without the leaders in that movement. We had incredible leadership from legislators. Our House sponsor was Representative Maura Hirschauer, who's really with the bill from its very first iteration. And our sponsor in the Senate was Senator Selena Villanueva. And in addition to those legislative leaders, we also had the great fortune of really having advocacy leaders as well, first and foremost of which was Manny Alvarez, who is the surviving son of Karina Gonzalez, whose name is the name assigned to our bill. So we, of course, couldn't have done it without those folks at the helm. and they were not the only puzzle piece. So I'll pass it back to Marlia to talk a little bit more about what went into making that change possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Shelby. And really, as we said earlier, obviously this report and this presentation is about reviewing the 103rd General Assembly, but it's also celebrating and taking a moment to thank everyone for your contribution to passing not only Karina's bill, but to also advocating for legislation that impacts survivors and community service providers. And so progress is impossible without all of us. And so here's a heat map of Karina's law advocacy efforts throughout Illinois and kind of where all of our advocates were that participated in our campaign. We had over 1,700 individual advocates who participated at any given point. There were over 7,500 connections with legislators, whether that be via email, call, or social media. And we had a coalition of more than 45 local and national organizations that put their name on Karina's bill, endorsed it, and they separately might have been driving, their own action alerts, their own calls, their own emails, their own social media. And so this is just a very small fraction of kind of all of the advocacy that happened with all of our partners and the more than 45 organizations that built a coalition to pass and advocate for Karina's bill. And finally, there were more than 100 news stories prior to the passage of Karina's bill that just highlighted kind of the importance of passing the measure and what it was included. And a lot of that, was covering the individual cases that kind of shed light on why it was so important to address this intersection of domestic violence and firearms. So key changes in Karina's law, what exactly does it do? So it clarified that judges can issue the firearm remedy or box 14.5 during the emergency or ex parte stage of the order of protection process, which we know that the emergency stage, that point where a survivor makes that decision to leave, goes to the court, is the highest point time of lethality for folks. And that was kind of the urgent need, right? Was to address that emergency stage and make sure that judges knew that they could grant and issue this firearms relief as part of that emergency phase of the order of protection. It also created stronger options, including an option for a surrender order, so you giving up your firearms, and a search warrant option if the surrender order wasn't enough to address that kind of immediate nature and threat of firearms. And so making sure and verifying that that respondent comes into compliance with the order was also a big piece of that. In criminal orders of protection for the search warrant option, the state's attorney on the criminal case must work with law enforcement to file and petition for that search warrant on behalf of that survivor. And so the goal here is that this is still survivor driven. The survivor is asking for this, informed of the process, and that state's attorney is then working with law enforcement to petition for that search warrant when and if it's asked for and sought out. On the civil order of protection side, when it comes to search warrants, it was really important for us to have an option where civilians can petition for the search warrant directly. So think of this as our FRO law or our Firearm Restraining Orders Act, our red flag law, where civilians can actively participate in that petitioning process. And so the petitioner can file the search warrant directly in civil orders of protection. Law enforcement, once they receive that search warrant, may file a petition to modify if they identify that there are mistakes that may inhibit their ability to execute the search warrant. And they also can ask for an extension to execute if under certain circumstances, if they need more time and doing some of that research and safety planning for themselves and for the survivor and individuals who may be in the facility. The statute also does outline a timeline for law enforcement to act to execute that search warrant. And as I mentioned, that extension of timeline is part of that timeline. And then finally, a big one was that Karina's Law closes the transfer loophole and created a petition process for the respondent's firearms to be transferred to a third party under certain circumstances. It's important to note that this is after the initial surrender or seizure of the firearm. So either that respondent has surrendered their firearms as part of that order of protection, or they have had them removed as part of the search warrant. So the first option is if the firearms have been surrendered to law enforcement, either at the time of service or if they're not on that person at that time of the service of order of protection, that surrender has to happen within 24 hours of service, and they can do that at a local law enforcement agency. Law enforcement, importantly, must also provide a receipt to the respondent and to the court to verify that those firearms have either been surrendered or have been seized. And this documentation is really important because it helps verify, one, with the court that the firearms have actually been removed, but two, it helps that respondent have the documentation they need if they later in the process want to petition to get their firearms transferred and or get them back at the end of the order of protection. And so the final piece of that, as I mentioned already, after surrender, the order of protection, respondent can file a petition to transfer the firearms to a third party, and there are kind of parameters around that petition process. So training on Karina's Law. We just had our first training on Karina's Law, which was an overview of what was included in the law, kind of the parameters that we're working under, and that took place this past Friday. But we will have a number of training opportunities that are coming up, so we'd encourage you to keep your eyes on our training website, sign up for our mailing list, and follow us on social media because we do share all of our trainings and we do share if there is a change to our training times, location, etc. So we would encourage you to scan the QR code for our training website to monitor that, but also sign up for our mailing list so that you get notified every time that we are doing something, whether that's measuring safety, a policy initiative, or a training opportunity. So with that, I will pass it over to Shelby to take us through the rest of the presentation to talk about all of the other legislation that passed that was survivor-centered during the 103rd General Assembly.
Awesome. Thanks, Maralia. I have the pleasure of walking us through a lot of information. It is good news that there were so many bills passed into law that will impact survivors and providers in a positive way. It is also a lot of information, so I'm going to ask folks to do their best to listen in. Know that you are able to revisit these materials. They will be posted on our website and distributed to the registrants for this training. So don't feel like you have to remember all of this word for word. We're going to walk through 30 laws that were passed during the 103rd General Assembly. And as Marley has already shared, they're organized into sort of 5 major categories. For most of our readers who are doing direct service work, we really encourage you to think about these categories like a roadmap. So thinking about, what information might be relevant to the work that you do day in and day out. If you are, for example, someone involved in training and education, check out that prevention education section. If you are an attorney whose work focuses on helping survivors enforce their rights, or somebody whose work involves resourcing survivors, check out that survivor rights and resources section to navigate this most easily. I know we are very fortunate to have lots of organization leaders in the room today. We're very happy to have you here. And if you are in leadership at a domestic violence or sexual violence nonprofit, we would really encourage you to read the report more like cover to cover, just because there is so much information that might help you in making sure that your staff are trained on new rights. You're aware of new opportunities for intervention and for funding, all of those good things. So we would encourage those folks to read the report cover to cover. We chose to identify these particular laws because they all had some sort of concrete impact on survivors or the folks who work with them. And all of those choices were really informed by our policy platform. So you will see we have a QR code here on the screen, and folks are more than welcome to scan that and take a closer look if you're really curious about how the network kind of chooses where our focus goes at any given time. The last thing I'll say on this slide is that, as I mentioned, we're going to cover a lot of material today with these 30 new laws. I'm going to be talking about them at a very, very high level. You'll see that we've provided more detailed summaries in the reports themselves, and we would encourage you to go to the report if you have follow-up questions. But I also just want to name that, of course, Karina's Law was our flagship legislation. And we did work closely on several pieces of legislation that we will touch on today. But many, many of these laws are not the result of primarily work by the network, but rather by all of the other phenomenal organizations who are doing advocacy work in this space. Many of them are our members, many of them are our partners, and we're very proud to really uplift the work that they've done. But I mentioned that because we may not be experts on the details of the laws themselves. So please feel free to use the question feature or the chat function in this Zoom call. We will do our best to address your questions. And if we are perhaps not the subject matter expert, we will do our best to direct you to the folks who were really at the helm of whatever piece of legislation you're curious to learn more about. So all of that detail out of the way, let's go ahead and jump in. For our court system, lots of really great changes that came out in the last 2 years. And you'll see as we go through this presentation, there are asterisks next to some of these bill numbers. That indicates that a piece of legislation was a particular priority for the network. So priority legislation usually had some kind of direct hands-on work from network staff or our larger community, be that being involved in working groups, platforming issues through our policy action alert system, or other things of that nature. All of those priority bills are included at the back of our report in a voting record, which we're going to talk more about later, but that's why you're seeing that indicator. So when we look at all the changes to our court system, first and foremost, we have HB 2954, which protected survivors who've been subjected to doxing. For folks who don't know, doxing is when somebody shares your personal information, think your address, your phone number, your email, with that malicious intent to cause you some kind of harm or distress. This particular law provided both economic empowerment and further sort of options of recourse in our court system to repair harm when that happens to someone. The network was specifically involved in a working group on this bill, and it was a part of our priority legislation. HB 3103 was a piece of legislation that expanded protections for our active members of military. So those folks can historically file for protective orders through the military court system and have those enforced by military law enforcement. But this new legislation allows those folks to also file in civilian court and be subject to civilian law enforcement as well. So that was a good extension of those rights there. SB 382 did a lot of work to protect survivors who've been subjected to what we call the non-consensual dissemination of private sexual images, which is more commonly referred to as revenge porn. Specifically, this was an expansion that helped to include folks who perhaps didn't qualify before. For example, if your face was not in an image, but your body was, you perhaps would not have qualified historically, and now you would qualify for all the same protections and reliefs thanks to this new legislation. HB 2123 also paired really nicely with that. So this was an expansion of protection for folks who've been subjected to the spread of digitally forged images. So again, these are largely those images of a sexual nature. And historically, you were not able to file for protections or sort of recourse if that image was altered in some way or if it was artificially generated altogether, but you were still the subject of it. And this law sort of now expands to protect folks who are subject of authentic or altered images, since the impact of those is the same. SB 2683 expanded SNCO eligibility. And for folks who don't know, that's our stalking no contact orders. And that expansion really covered electronic monitoring as forms of abuse that are prohibited under the statute and that are eligible for protection under the order. And also just kind of articulated some forms of electronic and digital abuse that historically haven't really gotten the same sort of accommodation and protection. So that was a really valuable expansion we saw as well. HB 5172 gave us some stronger language accessibility in the court system, which is really wonderful for folks who speak little to no English. We often hear that this is an issue. And the new law requires that judges ask about language needs and make sure that folks have the accommodation they need, even if they're self-represented and perhaps didn't know to ask about that on their own. And lastly, when we look at our court system changes, we have HB 5164, which reduced a bunch of the barriers to the name change process in Illinois. We know that survivors often have to change their names, be it for safety reasons or for gender affirming reasons. But this just sort of made that process a little bit easier and a lighter load for folks. On to our next section, which is criminalized survivor relief. You'll see here we had several bills related to trafficking that passed that we were very excited to see move. First and foremost was HB 3414, which was the Prevent Unfair Sentencing of Youth Act. You'll see here we have a handout from our members over at CASE who were really leaders on this bill. And of course, I will offer that I cannot provide a comprehensive list of every organization that worked on every bill. Please forgive us if we've not named your organization specifically. But this particular piece of legislation created a lot of really wonderful flexibility and new options for criminalized minor survivors who are facing prosecution. This was identified as one of our legislative priorities in 2023, which means that through our associated advocacy campaign, we were driving emails and witness slips to legislators from our larger community. So all of those folks who participate in those action alerts, this is one of those many laws that you helped pass as well. HB 2418 paired really nicely with this, created opportunities for stronger criminal records relief for these folks who've been subjected to trafficking. And that's really important for improving access to housing, employment, a bunch of other resources of that nature. That was another priority bill for us in 2023. And lastly, another sort of element of improving protections for survivors of sex trafficking in the state was HB 5465, which created some additional privacy protections for folks who, in particular, were criminalized in their youth. We also had some really wonderful improvements to the Gender-Based Violence Resentencing Act. That's what we're going to talk about next here. SB 2260 was specifically what we call a trailer bill, sort of a follow-up corrections bill to that original Gender-Based Violence Resentencing Act. Our members over at Women's Justice Institute were really at the helm of this effort. You'll see one of their educational handouts here on the screen before you. And it was designed to really make sure that folks were able to access this relief as it was originally designed and intended. This bill was one of our priority legislation pieces in 2023 and was a part of our advocacy campaign. SB 3285 was also a sort of follow-on change to the Gender-Based Violence Resentencing Act. It was specifically related to an Illinois Supreme Court ruling that had sort of interpreted the law in a different way than it was intended. And so this legislation created some more clear avenues for folks who have criminal convictions, specifically who took a plea deal, just making sure that it's clear that they were eligible for this same relief. This bill was passed in 2024 and was on our 2024 priorities advocacy campaign. On to Section 3, Survivor Rights and Resources. Again, I know we're moving through these quickly, so feel free to be using that chat function and that Q&A function if any questions are cropping up as we move through these. HB 1342 was a transportation omnibus package. Basically, it covered a ton of stuff related to transportation. And one of its many elements was the creation of the RTA Survivor Transportation Pilot Program. This was a new, very valuable resource for survivors in need of transportation access. And the legislation also gave our community a voice related to public transit decision making. The network was involved with the House and Senate sponsors on this bill. We both helped to shape the bill and implement it. And we specifically put out a whole volume of measuring safety on this program already this year. So if folks are interested in hearing more about the RTA pilot project, many of the member organizations in the room did participate in that project. You can find that report on our website. SB 3713 made a series of changes to the Crime Victims Compensation Program. CVC is how it's colloquially referred to. And it made the program much more accessible with the intention of hopefully improving the rate of applications that are approved among survivors in the future. CVC is a really valuable tool for addressing financial costs related to abuse. And the network did identify this legislation as one of our 2024 priorities. So it was a part of those waves of emails and witness slips that went out in that year. SB 3652 was a really wonderful expansion of housing rights, really our opportunities to learn about and then exercise those housing rights. It required that the state create a sort of like informational handout about the Safe Homes Act, specifically what those rights are under the Safe Homes Act and how to exercise them. And then that handout has to be attached to every lease in the state moving forward. So that was a really wonderful opportunity to continue educating folks about those rights and exercising those rights. That was another of our priorities in 2024 and included in our advocacy campaign. We also had, of course, our budget bill during this General Assembly. It was HB 3817. Lots and lots and lots of things go into a budget bill, but what we are always interested in, of course, is the domestic violence and sexual violence funding lines. In this particular passage of the bill, we sustained the domestic violence funding line at $70 million, which was really important because that was a relatively new amount. It was increased substantially just a few years ago. And sustaining that level of funding was really, really important to the community, being able to really keep that growth going and keep those services in place. We also saw an incredible growth in the sexual assault budget line. It moved from $7.6 million up to $20 million, which was a call made specifically by the Illinois Coalition Against Sexual Assault, and was sort of meant to address the crisis in funding that was created by several years of federal funding cuts. Together, this budget bill really helped us to ensure that services for survivors continue across the state, facilitating those pathways to safety and to healing. We are particularly proud of that work we were able to do with ICASA, and I'd love to just elevate that was our most successful, sort of largest single campaign that we ran during the 103rd Illinois General Assembly. 514 advocates participated in that campaign, calling on legislators to up this budget line. And together, they made more than 13,000 connections with legislators via email, via phone call, and social media post. So a big thank you to everybody who was a part of that effort, and a big congratulations that really resulted in such concrete change. Another of these bills was HB 2841, which specifically creates some new avenues to accessing vital records without cost. So if a survivor perhaps lost access to their vital records due to abuse, maybe they had to flee the home or their records were being withheld from them, they can receive a waiver so that they do not have to pay to get new copies of those vital records, which are, of course, an important gateway to lots of other resources. And we have several more of these rights and resources bills to touch on. HB 2493 specifically expanded VESA, which is the Victims Economic Security and Safety Act. It provided survivors and their loved ones with some new accommodations related to when somebody passes away from a violent crime and their loved ones are seeking time away from work. We also had two laws passed that go really nicely together, HB 1363, which created a new lawsuit process for compensation when a survivor is subjected to gender-based violence in the workplace, and HB 5371, which created some additional additional recourse outside of a lawsuit for survivors experiencing violence at work. So those are really good sort of pair together. HB 4768 specifically provided some new anti-retaliatory measures, protections for survivors who speak out against their landlords who are engaged in unlawful behavior, or who seek out support from legal aid attorneys or community organizations to enforce their rights. This also included protections for folks who go to the media to talk about unlawful behavior by their landlord. And lastly, in these rights and resources, we have HB 1168. And this law specifically protects genetic privacy for survivors of sexual assault. So if those folks are providing DNA in the course of a sexual assault investigation, they are now protected such that that DNA is never used in any other context. So it can't be used in a separate criminal investigation where perhaps the survivor is the subject of the investigation. So we're really making sure that when that DNA is being collected, it is only being used for its original purpose. Just two sections left. This is our healthcare system. Several changes to our healthcare system in the last 2 years, starting with SB 1909. And this is the only piece of legislation that we highlighted that does not have a clear implementation date. So this bill was passed out of the House and the Senate. It was signed into law by the governor. But it is currently subject to an ongoing federal court case. So we will not know when and if this law goes into effect until that court case is resolved. But if and when it is resolved, it will strengthen access to reproductive health care for survivors by prohibiting deceptive practices among limited service pregnancy centers. So basically, this law is designed to say that interfering with somebody seeking emergency contraceptives, seeking abortion care, would be illegal and would have a variety of consequences if, as an organization, you interfere with that inquiry for reproductive health care. HB 5431 furthered reproductive justice for incarcerated survivors who are pregnant and postpartum by doing two really essential things. It ends the practice of shackling pregnant and in labor and postpartum incarcerated folks who are historically have been shackled, perhaps during the process of giving birth. And it also increased the nutrition requirements during pregnancy and that postpartum period so that both parent and baby are getting all that they need nutritionally, even though they are also incarcerated. Both of these bills were featured in our different legislative priority lists and were parts of our advocacy efforts in 2024. SB 1344 ensured reproductive freedom and access to gender-affirming care by making several updates to PAPA, which is the Patient and Provider Protections Act that was passed in 2022. So this is another one of those trailer bills that's sort of a follow-up clarification and correction bill. And it did a number of things. It expanded some things related to insurance coverage. It did some work to improve reporting requirements. It increased access to HIV medication, and it did some work to protect folks' privacy when it comes to their medical records. So lots of really great changes specifically to PAPA in that bill. HB 5239 protects survivors who experience reproductive coercion and abuse and then need to travel to Illinois to access care. So this sort of means that the state cannot participate in or cooperate in any sort of investigation conducted by a hostile state towards reproductive or gender affirming care if a resident of that other state came to Illinois seeking care. SB 2933 protected survivors who might have accrued medical debt related to their abuse from having some of those most substantially negative impacts of having medical debt. So by preventing that debt from being reported to debt collectors, it helps to ensure that credit scores and other lines of credit are not as negatively affected as they might have otherwise been. And lastly, HB 5142 guaranteed that survivors seeking all forms of reproductive health care are covered by insurance. So this did things like expanding coverage of insurance for like a doula during pregnancy, things of that nature. We're on our last category. We're going to talk a little bit about changes to the world of prevention education. HB 2756 added training requirements, specifically domestic violence training requirements, to the licensing and renewal process among masseuses in the state of Illinois, which is, of course, really great because it creates another opportunity that if somebody were to disclose to their masseuse, that masseuse is equipped to receive that disclosure in a more trauma-informed way and prepared to make appropriate community referrals. HB 342 created some new training opportunities for educators, specifically around trauma-informed practices in service days, which of course would help to better equip them to receive disclosures from child survivors and perhaps respond to misbehavior in the classroom in a more trauma-informed way. This pairs really nicely with HB 3690, which also requires that teachers and school staff receive both domestic violence and sexual assault training at least once every 5 years. These two together really make sure that our educators are prepared to receive those students and connect them to the resources that they deserve. I'll just put a flag here that like if we're listening for places where services can adapt, change, grow in response to some of these laws, folks who are in the world of prevention education might identify some of their local massage parlors, some of their local schools, and make sure to follow up and say, hey, you know, there was this law change, and we would love to be that source of education for you to make sure you stay in compliance with these changes. That is everything we have on all those other bills that were passed into law in the last 2 years. We will touch on your questions at the end, but I also want to quickly elevate the voting records that you'll find at the back of the report. I will start this section by just reminding everybody that, of course, the network is a 501c3 organization. We do not endorse any candidate for public office or any current elected official. By providing this voting record, we are hoping to engage our community in really having an informed tool that can guide their conversations with elected officials, and of course to underscore the importance of engaging in advocacy and in civic action on policies related to gender-based violence. The voting record reflects the vote of every representative and every senator on 10 key bills that were passed into law during the 103rd General Assembly. And we will kind of talk through how to interpret that here in just a moment. But take this as your friendly reminder from the network to register to vote and always participate in every opportunity to vote on our elected officials. Of course, if you aren't sure who represents you, that's a great place to start. If you don't know what your district number is, your representative's name, your senator's name, you can always look that up. You'll see we have a link here at the top of the slide. If you go to tiny URL, find my IL elected, it will help you identify exactly who represents you in these voting records. And what you'll see is we've got those 10 bills laid out here. All of these had those priority markers throughout the presentation. So if you want to look up what that bill was, you can, kind of flip back and then come back to this voting record. You'll see there are 4 primary indicators in the voting record. Anywhere you see a green check means that they voted yes on the bill. All of these are bills that we are hoping, of course, to see a yes vote for because they are survivor-centered legislation. And X in a red circle is a no vote. Anywhere you see one of these dashed circles, that's some other kind of vote. So that might be an absentee vote, a no voting vote, anything of that world, an excused vote, things like that. And lastly, anywhere you see the NA text is somebody who was presumably not in office when that vote took place, that there's no voting data for that person. So in some cases, somebody might have held office for a while and then chose to retire, or perhaps was stepping in to fill that new seat midway through the session. And that is why you'll see that not everybody has a full voting record on all of these bills. That is the last of the information we have to share with you from this report. Just a couple of invitations, really, as we wrap this up. First and foremost, we would love to have all of you get involved in our policy advocacy work. If you were interested in what you heard, if you were perhaps inspired to remember that progress really is possible if we show up and engage, we would invite you to sign up for our policy action alerts. You can always expect those to have clear prompts to take action, background on what we need you to know to take that action. And they'll always be brief action opportunities. So they're never going to ask more than 5 minutes of your time. You can scan the QR code here or visit our website to join our Policy Action Alert Network. And lastly, we invite you to stay connected with the measuring safety process. This is volume 2 of several in the docket for this year. And to get any details that you missed on this report or any of our other upcoming reports, you can visit our website. You can download our report there. You can check out our social media toolkit there. And of course, you can sign up for our measuring safety mailing list. So you can scan this QR code if you want to take a look at everything in more detail.
Perfect. So thank you all so much again for joining. We really appreciate all your support to our team, our advocacy, action alerts, and also for our Measuring Safety series. So we hope to see you at our next presentation.